Hi all, Brian Meermans from Bloom Tech here. Congratulations, you've knocked this Replit class out of the park. You've gone from nothing to a fully functioning Sketch app. At this point, you have a working project. Along the way, you've seen a lot of the building blocks of the Java language. But these skills are not limited to Java. The concepts you have learned here will translate amazingly to many other languages. Today is about cleaning up our code and thinking about additional customization that can really make this app unique for your own needs. How far can you go?
So here we are, final part. What are we going to do? We already have a working project. Well, here's a hint. What if we could add additional features to this project? Every time a programmer works on anything, they always get to the end of the project and think, what else could we do? So I've got a new feature on this project already ready to go. So if I were to come up here and I change it to some color orange, for example, I could change the thickness of my pen and get a thicker line. That's a nice feature. Does every program need to have that? No. Depends on what your project needs it to have. What if you wanted to have a highlighter so you could change it not just from a regular pen to a highlighter so it's partially transparent? Technically, we could add that in. What if you wanted to have an undo and redo button so that you could undo the last thing you did or redo what you did before? Technically, we could add that in. Some of these would require a lot more knowledge than you're currently at right now. And it might require us to completely redo the project, which probably not going to happen at this point, but there's some really cool things you want to do. What I want to talk about first, though, is that something every single programmer should do at the end of writing their program is to go back and review it and reflect on it and realize, is there something I could have done better? And one of the first things I want to look at is numbers in our project. So if I come over to my code for my Sketchpad where you're at, I can look and realize there's a number 5 here, there's a number 5 here. If you remember off the top of your head what that number 5 was, fantastic, good on you. But if you look at this back 6 months from now and you go back and look at this code and realize, what was that number 5? You may not remember at all what that number was. One thing that programmers want to do is maybe they use numbers to start with their code just to get things to work and make certain it's testable. But later they want to get rid of as many numbers as they possibly can and turn them into values. What did this 5 represent? Well, that was the location, the X coordinate value of the clear button. Maybe I make a variable for that. So our first task today is think, is there a way to remove most, maybe not all, but most of the numbers and make them named values so we can go and still identify what our code is doing, but now we can read it better, especially when someone else is trying to look through our code, or we're looking at our code months from now. That's step number 1. Step number 2, here's this initial launch method. And if you look through it, it's pretty long. Like it goes all the way down to there. And if I can't see all of my code in a small block, I like to think of lines of code, maybe 5, maybe 10 lines of code at a time. I don't like to look at things as 30 lines of code at a time. It's just too much. So what a lot of programs like to do is figure out a way to break that down into smaller pieces, name those small pieces, and instead of saying initial launch does all of this, instead you say, well, maybe this section right here could be its own sub method that then initial launch calls, and initial launch looks like it's doing 4 things. But those 4 things are broken down smaller. So that's our constant idea right now is how do we review, reflect, and change our code to make it easier to maintain, easier to identify what's going on. Maybe it doesn't even affect the way our code runs, but it affects the way us humans look at it. Let's start with the first task. We're going to remove what are called literal values. So if you ever have code that has numbers inside of it, you have to consider, is that number useful for anybody else in the world to look at and go, I know what that means? And the answer is, I don't know. I don't know what that means necessarily. It's like this 5, this 20, what do they represent? These are called literal values, or sometimes called magic numbers. Literally, if you're looking around code and you see a number in there and you say, oh, I don't know what that is. It's just magic. Someone just magically put it on my screen. We like to get rid of those magic numbers, those literal values, and figure out a way to name them. And that becomes a situation where we go to the top of code and we say, well, we can write variables. We know how to make variables. We'll just start identifying what those pieces of numbers are going to be and adjust from there. For example, let's start right off the bat. The number 0 in this loop represents we're counting from 0 to 500. I don't think of that as a literal value. I think of that start at 0, count towards 500. But this 500, can you think of a way to name that? What does it represent? Well, let's think about this. This piece of code says, let's generate many random circles. How many? I don't know. Right now, 500. But let's change that up. Let's say that this is going to be number of circles. I'm going to make a variable called desired number of circles. Notice how I'm changing this up a little bit because we've never uppercased our variable names before. The reason I'm doing that is I don't want that value to ever change. I want it to be something that's kind of yelling at you and say, that's a yelled at thing. That's oftentimes how we do our literal values is we name them uppercase. Now that 500 needs to be put somewhere. That means I need to make this variable. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up here and I'm going to name some values up here. And I can put it wherever I need to, but I'm going to name some values. Let's say we do some literal values here. And I'm going to make a private that was an integer. I can call it whatever I want to. Since I wrote desired number of circles there, I'm going to write desired number of circles here. And I'll set it to the 500 that it used to be. And now when I'm reading my code, I'm like, oh, you want 500 circles. That was the desired number of circles. Now, do you like that variable name? I don't know. I like to keep my variable names easy enough to identify what they mean, but not necessarily too long to type out. And there's one last thing I want to add in here. If this value is not going to change and you do not expect to change in your program at all, we make it a final value. Word final says it is a one-time set. You set it once to whatever the number is, maybe 500, and it's not allowed to change from that point on. And that means that uppercase makes more sense. Don't attempt to change this. It's yelling at you. It's got a certain value. It's staying that value. We've just got rid of one of our numbers. I'm going to keep the 0. I think 0 is a perfectly valid number. Let's do one or two more of these, and then I'll let you pause afterwards and figure out how much can you do on your own. How many of these numbers do you think make sense to get rid of? So for example, this 30, this is the interior sketch. What does that 30 represent? Well, that 30 is how far over the x-coordinate is for the rectangle. Now that also is the same 30 here is how far down that is. Those two numbers actually represent the same thing because it's kind of like the border. And so what I might decide is, well, let's come up here and decide, let's make a variable that represents the border. So in my literal values, let's make a private, we'll make it a final int. Maybe we call it margin and set it to 30. And now everywhere that 30, which represented a margin, don't look for every 30. Most 30s that represent margins will be margin now. Instead of writing 30, you write margin. What could you do here to make 540 make sense? What does that 540 represent? That 540 is supposed to be how wide our rectangle is. Well, I don't want to make another variable for this one, actually. I don't want to make yet another variable. Instead, what I'm going to use is I'm going to ask the screen. The screen has a certain width already. And if I use the screen's value, the screen has a method. If we go back over to the documentation and open that up, the screen has a method pre-built into it, literally called getWidth and getHeight. Great. So right here, this 540, that's supposed to be how wide my interior rectangle is going to be. And let's imagine our screen is 600 wide and our margin is 30. There's two margins. 600 minus 30 would be the right result. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask my screen, how wide are you? I'm going to subtract away from it the margin twice. I can do that 2 times margin, or I can do subtract margins minus another subtract margin. I can do 2 subtractions. I'll do the same thing here for the 340, but it's going to be, instead of 340, it's going to be screen.getHeight minus 2 times the margin. And that's a long line of code now. So I might decide, hey, this is a good comma. Let me put an enter there. And let me put an enter here so I can see those line up a little better. Maybe even make an enter there. And I can say, hey, to draw the interior sketch, we are making 3. Notice I do have 2 numbers in there still, 2 literal values in there, but those are not standard literal values. That's just the number 2 because I need 2 of my margins to go away. If my screen size changes, I still need 2 margins to make this calculation make sense. So I don't need to worry about that being a variable. It kind of makes sense as a 0 makes sense there, the 2 makes sense here, and that's going to be this case several different times. If you're ever trying to cut a value in half, divide by 2 makes perfect sense. People can read that. 6 months from now, you're going to read that and you go, oh, I'm dividing by 2, I'm cutting in half. This says I'm doubling the margin. But the margin value being a variable now makes so much more sense for long term. And if I decide in the future that I like to have a smaller margin or a larger margin, I can come up here and change it once and say, hey, I like the margin to be 50 instead. And now all of my screen will adjust correctly. So this is the idea of making values to get rid of these literal values, to get rid of that 60. I'd much rather that be a value that's calculated, either stored here or calculated on the fly. And my challenge for you right now is, how many of these numbers can you get rid of, these 5s and these 20s? How many of these numbers can you get rid of, make them into a variable, and make that variable still make sense? I challenge you to that right now, but if you'd like to, check the tutorial. We'll have some hints and some solutions for different numbers you could change. And you could just play with the Sketchpad for right now, but also there's a couple numbers in some of the other programs we wrote. So if you look at the classes for the buttons, you might see a couple numbers in there that might make more sense to be changed out for non-numbers. All right, that's your first challenge. So, second challenge. I do not like the fact that this method is so long. I'm actually going to close a lot of this stuff out just to see what's going on here. This method right here, this initial launch method is super long. And it's kind of a nice rule of thumb that if you can't see the entire code on one screen, you probably have a chance to refactor that code. Refactor means just rewrite it in a slightly different way, either to make it easier to read, or sometimes it's a bigger situation. But we're just going to rewrite that a slightly different way. So if you think about this, if I could come up with like a couple of different situations that really is going on here. So what is initial launch doing? Think about it. It is building the background. So displaying the background. What's in the background? The background includes the actual giant rectangle color and the circles. I think the circles are part of the background. What's another thing it's doing? Let's see. It's building the interior sketch. So it's actually like drawing the interior sketch. Display the interior sketch. Okay, that's the big white rectangle. What else is it doing? It's got some buttons going on. So it's got the ability to have the clear button display itself and the pen buttons display themselves. So let's see here. What's another thing it's doing? It's displaying the buttons. And if I were to kind of think of all that, that's one possible breakdown. There's many breakdowns. This is one possible breakdown to say, these are three things initial launch are actually doing. And right now, this whole section right here is what the display background is doing. And let's see, this section right here is the interior sketch. And I believe all of this section down here, which is still kind of long on its own, but all of that is about displaying the buttons. And so all I'm going to do is I'm going to refactor my code by turning these into smaller pieces of code that are a little bit easier to have a bite-sized feel of, that I feel like I can read those because they're smaller. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to switch off the initial launch. I'm going to say close that off. And instead, I'm going to call methods. And the methods I'm going to call are I'm going to make up. So we're going to make a method specifically for displaying the background. Let's call it display background. So I type in display background semicolon. You can't just write that though. Feeder has no idea what display background is. So I'm going to come down here. And where originally this was interior my code, I'm now going to write a public void method called display background. And it'll have its own curly bracket start and a curly bracket to end. And I think this code right there is the interior part of that method. Has anything actually changed in the code? No. Initial launch is still running display background, and it's still running this exact same code, except now I have a name for this section. And if I feel like that section is doing perfectly valid, I don't have to go look at the entire code and kind of scroll through and realize, oh, this is the part that's about displaying backgrounds. This is the part about doing anything else. I have a single section that's about display background. And even better is that most locations where you write code, you have this ability to tab them off and say, I don't even want to see the interior of that anymore. It's not gone. I'm just collapsing it, but I don't want to see the interior of that anymore because I know that method works as intended. So why don't you try right now, make yourself a display interior sketch method. You can call it whatever you want to, but display interior sketch makes sense. And then make another method called display buttons and take these sections and put them correctly into the right ones. Try it now. All right, here's what I would do. I would probably call a method called display interior sketch. And again, this method name doesn't have to be that. And I'll make another method called display buttons. And again, the method doesn't have to be called that. I can get rid of these comments because now that makes perfect sense. Display the background, boom. Display the interior sketch, boom. Display the buttons. These two don't exist on their own, so I'm going to write some methods for them by writing public void display interior sketch. I'm going to put the code that's specifically about the interior sketch, which is this section right here, in there. And what I'm looking for is, as a programmer, I really like to have code that's inside a method, 1, 5, 10 lines max usually. There's some times that that's going to be broken, of course, but this is 2 lines of code, and that's so much easier to process in my head what it does. And I also need the other one for display buttons. So we're going to do a public void display buttons. And there's an argument to be made that there's actually 2 different main types of buttons to do right now. So maybe I should have done a separate method for display the clear button and then display the color buttons. All right, I'm going to get rid of some of these comments now. And I have one extra curly bracket that I have because I got to make certain my curly bracket here lines up and ends there. And this one's just an extra one just sitting there. I can't have that. That is the bane of a lot of program resistance, is one extra curly bracket in Java can mean a really bad problem. So make certain you're watching these lines. You see how this curly bracket here has a vertical line lining it up perfectly with that one? Always check for that. So challenge for you. This update's super long. Can you break it down into smaller pieces and say, okay, update means do this, this, and this. And you only see 3 or 4 lines of code. This is just reflecting on our code and realizing we could do it better. And the reality is nothing's changing, but for a human to read it now, it's so much easier. So now I'm getting into the point where I'm not going to show you anything except just some ideas. So we have this program. We have this program that says currently it clears the screen. It's always white. Maybe you don't like white as a background. Maybe you like a black background instead. Maybe you could decide that this is a black background because you like a darker screen. It's easier on the eye sometimes. If you're to do that, you might want to make this black and make that white, but that's personally your choice. Let's imagine you wanted to have this background be any color. Maybe you would like the background to be this pink fuchsia color, whatever that color actually is. Maybe you could make additional clear buttons. And each of the clear buttons works just like these up here, but maybe they go vertical instead. And so you have a clear button where the background color of the clear button is the color that you're going to erase the screen with and now display as the background. Can you figure out how to do that? I am not going to tell you how to do this time, but you can check the tutorial to find hints and eventual solutions. If you'd like to figure out a way to make that, you can make the background color whatever you want to. So maybe a vertical line of possible colors that are each buttons. You can say, I'd like to do that. You should use the same skill set you used when making this color bar up here. Try it out. Another thing you can do is that in the painting tool, we did not use all of these capabilities. So there's draw circles and draw lines and draw rectangles. We did all that. There's also a draw text. So if you'd like to, you could decide, I'd like to put some words on here. And so you might decide, hey, I like to put my name down here on the bottom right or something. Maybe over here has got your name. Or I like to put the word sketchpad up here to represent that's the logo of it. So if you'd like to try that, you can try adding in your own draw text. One thing to notice, though, is that this one takes in a string, not an int. So this word string there means it's a word or phrase. If you'd like to try that, put it in quotes, and you'll make text appear on the screen. So you could say draw text and then sketchpad, and then give it an X and Y coordinates and make it appear on the screen. So that's another potential option for you. Here's a bigger challenge. This one's actually a legitimate challenge. And again, check the tutorials to see how you could do this yourself. I have added in to my program the ability to do thicknesses of pens. Now, this is tricky. I had to make an array of pens, of buttons, and those buttons have to have the ability to have thicknesses on them. You do not have to go into huge detail here, but you could figure out a way to make these pens get thicker. Just to show you that in the documentation for the painting tool, there is a set line thickness method. So if you were to make a button that, when built, was told how thick it was going to be, you could then ask that button, when it's clicked, to call this method and change the line thickness. Now, I'm going to give you one hint, and again, check the tutorial to figure out how to do this a little bit better. But one hint is, if you look at any of the buttons we currently have, this is all of the information that is coming in to a clear button. So it's getting the X, the Y, the size, and the color. And all that information is going straight up to its parent and saying, hey, parent, which is the square button, take all the information. I don't need any of it. You need it. But there's nothing stopping you from saying that a clear button might need something else. In my clear button, we originally had a red slash through it. Maybe my clear button needs to have a color come in as the slash color. That's going to be what color this slash is going to be. Maybe I call it the incoming slash color. And now I could make myself a variable that only exists for a clear button that says private color slash color. And I'm going to add in one line of code here that says slash color equals incoming slash color. And so now when someone sends me that value, someone's going to have to send me a color now, or what red slash or whatever it's going to be, blue slash, green slash. I could then decide in my draw self, instead of saying set it to red, I could stay instead set it to slash color. There we go. But everywhere I'm building a clear button now needs to send me one more piece of information. They need to send me what color they're going to have for that slash as well. That same logic can be applied to a thickness button, where you have weight of the drawing line that you're going to have. And ultimately, each of these, when built, you could say, hey, I want this button to exist. I want it to exist here, 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 here. Here's the color of it. And the thickness is going to be thickness 1, 2, 3. These go from 1 to 8 for my particular drawings. It could be a really interesting challenge. Alternately, you could decide, let's just make 2 buttons. Maybe a button somewhere on the side, another button on the side that has a plus sign and a minus on it. When someone clicks the plus sign, you change a variable that you have to figure out where to store to get you 1 higher than it used to be. And it just means that's the thickness of line you want to draw with now. And someone clicks the minus sign, again, you change the variable to be 1 less than it used to be, and you just make the drawing a little bit smaller. I've seen both of these being used in any kind of paint program. So if you ever go into any kind of text editor, they have a plus sign and a minus sign, but they also have the ability to change the size of your font directly to something else. So those both exist. Sometimes both those options are in the same program. Be careful. If you put a minus sign in, you never want the size of your line to go smaller than 1. And if you get a plus sign in this program, if you make it larger than, say, I don't know, 15 or 16 or something, it's probably going to be really, really large. So you might want to limit it between like 1 and 16 on lengths. Those are few challenges. So that's a handful of things, but I want to mention things I would want to have. If I was going to make this program better, I'd want to figure out a few things. Maybe I figured out that there's a bug. There actually is a bug in this program originally. So if we were to load up the output here, and we were to run this program, there is one bug that you need to try to figure out on your own, which is if I change the color to green and I go to clear the screen, the background becomes green. Ooh, I don't like that. Relatively easy to make it so that when you're clearing the screen, the background becomes black. You have to first make the color of the lines turn black again. But is there a way to store a value representing the current color of the pen? So when you clear the screen, you temporarily make the line color black so the background becomes a black border, but then you reset the current color back to the current color that someone clicked. That's a good challenge. Harder challenges, things that we'd have to actually completely change the way this program works. I love the idea of an undo redo button. That requires us to learn other data structures other than arrays. Arrays let us store lots of information, but if we wanted to actually keep track of everything someone has done in the past, we need something a little bit more dynamic, and you'd have to learn a little bit more about Java. Things called stacks and queues, for example, would be perfect for storing what previously was occurring and what just originally did occur that you undid. There's so many changes you could do. You could make it so that when you're putting your mouse over one of these buttons, they get highlighted in some way so it looks like you're on top of them. Again, that requires a larger change than you would think. So that might not be something you could do right now, but things that we could do to make this better, to add features to our project. You'll learn how to do that if you continue on in Java.
Bear with me for a second. Think back to where you were right before you started this Replit class. How far have you come in just a few days? You've learned the basics of Java, and you built a fully functioning Sketch app. You should be really proud of yourself. Now, think ahead. Consider for a second how far you could go if you continue learning Java. What kind of life could you have if you got trained to become a backend developer? What could you do with the income that can come with the title of backend developer? What if you got to build things for a living, a job you liked, a job that was fun? If that's the kind of future you want, we at BloomTech can help you make it happen. BloomTech literally exists to train people just like you for great tech jobs, then work with them step by step until they're hired. This direct path to a tech job has worked for literally thousands of BloomTech graduates. Why not you? Completing the Let's Build a Sketch app shows me you're probably a great fit for BloomTech's backend development course. I want to personally invite you to check out this course. Remember, you can try it out with no payments and no commitments in the risk-free trial. What's stopping you? See how we can help you build cool projects and a better future. Check out bloomtech.com/Java for all the details. Thank you again for joining me here on Replit. I can't wait to see you at BloomTech.